An already fragile ceasefire agreement appears to be on thinner ice. President Trump is accusing Iran of not fully reopening the Strait of Hormuz, of course, a key piece of the deal between Iran and the United States.
Yeah, U.S. naval ships and warfighters are still on pause in the Middle East. President Trump says the U.S. military will remain in place in the region until an agreement is reached and all parties are in compliance. Iran again tightening its squeeze on the strait after accusing Israel of breaking the agreement by bombing Lebanon. But both the U.S. and Israel say it was not part of the agreement.
A ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon could be next. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the talks are planned between the two countries, as talks are expected today between the U.S. and Iran.
All right, joining us now, Dr. Naven Boppat, professor at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Boppat, thank you as always for joining us. We want to dive right into this, kind of what we were talking about before we came on air with you, where it stands right now, this ceasefire deal. What we're seeing here in the United States may be one thing, but the rest of the world looks like the U.S. is kind of giving in to Iran a little bit.
I'd say so. I think the perception globally is that the U.S. backed off from Iran, and that Iran, in effect, was able to hold the superpower at bay, which was something no Middle Eastern country has really been able to do. And so I think that's raised concerns amongst many U.S. allies in the region as to whether or not the U.S. really is trustworthy. The phrase that's been tossed around is that this is a Suez moment, referring to the British and the French invasion of the Suez after World War II, which they were told to pull back by Dwight Eisenhower. This does, I think, if it stands, will probably be looked at as a watershed moment that was a blow, I'd say, to American credibility. And just to emphasize, the U.S. military did everything it was supposed to do. It was told to eliminate Iran's Navy. It was told to eliminate Iran's Air Force. There was also the assassination of the leadership of Iran. So in that sense, from the military perspective, the tactical perspective, this was successful. But from the strategic perspective, the Strait of Hormuz is now still in jeopardy. So I think that's what is the issue and what has led to, I think, some of the negative views of the U.S. operation here.
So I just want to follow up on that, Professor Bobbitt, talking about whether or not the rest of the world sees this and whether or not the credibility of the United States. You said they did everything they were supposed to do, militarily-wise, in terms of the bombing campaign, working with Israel. Is it seen not a question of the U.S. might militarily, but maybe it's a negotiation? Is that where it seems weak? Because militarily-wise, I feel like they've done everything, as you kind of said. Where is the kind of, I guess, the view from the rest of the world that they didn't achieve what they needed to do is because you didn't get the Strait of Hormuz, you didn't get control of that, you didn't really get the regime change you're looking for?
I'd say it's the Strait of Hormuz, really, more than anything. And the regime change is part of it as well, because at the start of the conflict, the Trump administration did say it was interested in regime change. It then sort of walked back what regime change was and said that as long as the Ayatollah had been killed, that in effect was regime change. So that's not exactly right. The regime seems to be in a stronger position today than it was. And at least it has been battered, so it's still kind of holding on. But the Strait of Hormuz really is the key point, because since World War II, the United States has been looked at as the guarantor of open passage of the seas, especially the open flow of energy to the global market. And at the start of the conflict, the Strait of Hormuz was not controlled by Iran. It was open. There was considerable traffic, as the data point out. But after the war, or after this conflict and during the ceasefire, it looks like now Iran basically has turned into a de facto toll booth where they have some control over what ships pass and what ships don't. They're charging a fee. And the Trump administration said that it agreed to that 10-point plan, even though it's now disputing that was the 10-point plan it agreed to. So that does look like the U.S. is basically ceded to Iran having significant influence over the Strait of Hormuz, which is an enormous waterway. 20% of the world's energy goes through there. In sort of size, it's very small, but in terms of significance, it's huge. So I think that is something that the U.S. seems to have backed off from being the guarantor of open seas there.
Well, and even just hours after that deal was reached, the finger pointing started immediately of who violated which parts of that plan. But so there are some very important talks that are about to happen between the U.S. and Iran in Pakistan. What can we expect to come out of that?
I'm really not sure, because the interesting thing is that while the Trump administration or President Trump himself said the 10-point plan was a starting point, the Trump administration is now saying that the 10-point plan they were referring to was different than the 10-point plan that Iran was referring to, because the 10-point plan Iran was referring to was very absolutist, and it asked for things like the United States withdrawing from the region. It asked for things like, control over the Strait of Hormuz. So I don't think the U.S. would have agreed to that. So I think the two sides are starting at positions that are really very different. And so whether or not they can find common ground on there, I'm not sure. Part of the problem is they both made these commitments publicly, so it's hard to back away from these things. And I think Iran also feels like it has the upper hand here, right? So that's going to make them less willing to concede, where the United States is probably also not going to be willing to completely concede given the backlash that it's received. So I think it's going to be tough to actually get a settlement. And then add Israel into the mix with Israel's activity in Lebanon, which seems to be continuing. That's also going to complicate these talks.
Navin, one of your area specialties, you're working on right now a project that talks about the effectiveness of economic sanctions. You have a lot of research in terms of insurgencies and terrorist campaigns. I want to go back to the Strait of Hormuz, because if Iran essentially becomes a toll booth for that, that's part of the ceasefire agreement. They're able to take in, a little bit. They're making money off of this. What does that do to their ability to fund other terrorist factions like Hamas, Hezbollah, whoever else they want to fund there? And then also, if they're able to negotiate lesser sanctions and say what we had under the Obama deal, again, kind of to your point, does this give them the upper hand? And then even though they may say we're not going to fund Hezbollah or Hamas, they would have much more in terms of the financial income to do so if they wanted to, right?
So they would have more resources. The problem, I think, though, is that Hezbollah is in significant worse shape than it was several years ago, given the Gaza war. And some of the other Iranian proxies are also kind of battered by the conflict. The ones that are kind of effective are the Houthi in Yemen, and also some of the Iraqi ones. But and also then add to it, Iran has considerable economic problems of its own. So what they would do with that revenue, maybe they could funnel it into terrorist activities, and they probably would fund some. But I think that's going to be kind of limited given the damage that they have. Like Tehran has been destroyed along with other areas in Iran, so they have a lot of internal problems to worry about as well.
So while all of this is going on, we've mentioned Israel attacking Lebanon, Lebanon fighting back. What is the significance of that area, and why does Israel continue to say, hey, they weren't part of this, they're fair game?
Right. So Israel's claim is that they're trying to create a buffer zone in the southern part of Lebanon to avoid Hezbollah attacks. And so they want to clear that area and basically establish it as kind of a no-go zone, remove Hezbollah, which was Iran's primary arm in Lebanon. So I think they're tying it to this war with Iran. Now, Iran, in their 10-point plan, said that Israel should cease violence in Lebanon. So it looks like Israel's plan is to continue violence in the south while trying to negotiate with the government of Lebanon that's not Hezbollah. So it's kind of a two-tier track. And I think if you look at it from the Israeli perspective, they're trying to establish security for northern Israel. If you look at it the perspective from Lebanon, this looks like Israel is trying to annex that territory and take that territory away from Lebanon, which is an act of aggression. So again, that's a tricky issue, and that one is not something the U.S. can completely control unless it chooses to cut off Israel's military supplies, which I don't think it will. That really is Netanyahu's call, and he doesn't look like he's willing to back off from the buffer zone idea in southern Lebanon.
Navin, staying with that same train of thought there and talking about what Annie had just asked you, and kind of, again, going back to how weak in Iran is. With the weak in Iran, you say it's the head of the snake, right? So who is going to be the protector for places like Lebanon against countries like Israel? If Iran is in a weakened state, it seems like Israel would almost have free reign in that region to do what they want to, bar the United States or some sort of agreement in place saying these areas are off limits.
So Israel has a considerable strong hand in Lebanon right now. There's no question about that. But I think something to look back in the past is that when Israel has invaded Lebanon before, and it hasn't always gone well. Right? At some point, again, they've stayed there for some time, but eventually they were compelled to leave. Now, part of that was Iran's support for Hezbollah, for sure, right? But part of it also was just the difficulty. Lebanon is a complex country, right? So it's going to be difficult for Israel to try to take control of that territory, especially because Hezbollah is not the only resistance force in town. If it's the case that Israel tries to occupy southern Lebanon or occupy more of Lebanon, probably there'll be other Lebanese groups that try to resist. So that's going to be complicated for Israel, especially because Israel has multiple fronts now in Syria and other areas where they have to sort of fend off some other challenges. So it will be difficult. Even if Israel tries to do it, it's going to be challenging. Again, even absent or significant Iranian support, it's going to be hard.
All right, Dr. Nathan Boppett from UNC Chapel Hill, thank you so much for your time this morning and your insight as always.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.